What's up, night owls? Welcome back to Demon Sleep. Real quick, drop a comment and tell me where you're tuning in from tonight. I personally read every single one of them, and honestly, it makes my day seeing you all from around the world. If these dark tailies help you drift off or just escape reality for a bit, smash that like button and subscribe. But only if you think we've earned it. No pressure. Alright, lights off, rain on, blankets up. Let's dive into tonight's nightmare fuel. Shadow people. Why your brain shows you things that are there. He was standing over her. That is the image I cannot remove from my mind. My wife sleeping, her breath slow and even, and the figure darker than the dark bending toward her face with an attention so focused it was almost intimate. She did not wake, it did not move. I could not scream. To understand how we arrived here, we need to go back. There are shapes in the dark that predate humanity's capacity to name them. Before the first Sumerian pressed cuneiform into clay, before the oldest cave painter lifted ochre to stone in the fire-lit dark of Lascaux, before language itself existed as anything more than grunted alarm between creatures who had only just learned to walk upright, the figures were already there, standing, watching, dark against the dark and somehow, impossibly, darker still. This is not metaphor. I want to be precise about that, in the way that a man who has spent 11 years studying these accounts must be precise, not because precision brings comfort, but because the alternative, the poetic approximation, the shrug toward the ineffable, is a kind of cowardice I can no longer afford. The figures that humanity has been reporting across every culture, every continent, every century of recorded and unrecorded history are not symbols. They are not projections of cultural anxiety. They are not, as a certain school of neurological thought would have us believe, simply the brain misfiring in the hypnagogic state between wakefulness and sleep. They are consistent. That is what no one wants to talk about. Not the researchers, not the neurologists, not the psychiatrists who collect these accounts in manila folders and categorize them under sleep disorders as though the category itself resolves anything. The figures are consistent in a way that the word hallucination simply cannot account for, because hallucinations are personal. They draw from the specific contents of a specific human mind and produce specific, individualized imagery. A man who has never seen a spider does not hallucinate spiders. A child raised without exposure to a particular image does not generate that image from nothing. And yet the figures, described in Edo period Japan as the kanashibari, the bound by metal who press upon sleepers in the night. Described by the Inuit of the Arctic Circle as the Axarnian, the figures who walk across the sky. Described by medieval European scholars as the incubus and succubus. Described by the ancient Egyptians in the papyrus Ani as shadowed presences that attend the newly dead, and sometimes the living who have attracted their attention. Described today in Reddit threads and online forums and in the offices of sleep researchers in Oslo and Auckland and Sao Paulo and Cleveland, Ohio, by people who have never met, who share no mythology, no cultural framework, no common language, as the same thing. Dark human-shaped watching. Dr. Elliot Carver, Cognitive Neuroscience, University of Edinburgh, 2019. What we cannot explain is the specificity. Random neural firing during sleep transitions does not produce consistent, reproducible imagery across unconnected populations. That level of consistency requires either a shared stimulus or a shared structure. We are still determining which. This is the question that has consumed 11 years of my professional life, and I will confess, a not inconsiderable portion of my sanity. Not whether the figures exist. That question is settled by the sheer accumulated weight of human testimony across every century we can access. The question is what they are, whether they come from outside us or whether they come from something so deep inside us that the distinction no longer means anything useful. The question is whether, when we see them, we are looking outward or inward, and which answer would be worse. Poe, Right Arrow, Lovecraft, the academic distance, the controlled clinical voice, The scholar's illusion that if you describe something precisely enough, you can contain it. I had that voice for 6 years before I met Daniel Marsh, before he told me what had happened in his bedroom on the 14th of March. After that, the clinical distance became harder to maintain. It still is. Daniel Marsh was the kind of man you'd trust immediately. That's the first thing you'd notice, not how he looked, though he looked fine enough. 43 years old and a little soft around the middle in the way that men who used to play recreational basketball get when the weekends fill up with other things. No, what you'd notice first was the voice. Patient. A teacher's voice. Which, as it happened, was exactly what he was: American history and junior year English at Harlow Regional High School in Harlow, Maine, where he'd worked for going on 16 years. He had a life. That's what matters here, and I don't mean that dismissively. I mean it specifically. Daniel Marsh had the kind of full, ordinary, specific life that makes what happened to him land harder. He had a daughter, Emma, 9 years old, gap-toothed smile, obsessed with horses in the particular way that 9-year-old girls sometimes are, like it's a calling rather than a phase. He had a house on Birch Road that needed a new furnace, and had needed one for 3 winters running. But that was okay, because the old one still worked if you kept the thermostat under 68. He had a truck with 140,000 miles on it, and a gym membership he was actively not using, and a small vegetable garden out back where he grew tomatoes that were always a little better than you'd expect from Maine. He had Sarah. Sarah was not his ex-wife. Sarah was the woman he'd started seeing 8 months before the first time it happened, a librarian from Brewer, careful with her words and her laughter and her trust in the way that a woman who'd been careful for a long time learns to be. She had red hair the color of autumn maples and a habit of finishing crossword puzzles in pen, which Daniel found both impressive and slightly alarming. She stayed over on Tuesdays and Thursdays and most weekends when Emma was with her mother. She was staying over the night it started. It was February. Harlow in February is a specific kind of cold, not dramatic, not the blizzard and snowdrift cold of January, but a flat, gray, grinding cold that presses in from all sides and makes you feel like the world has always been exactly this cold and always will be. Daniel had been grading papers at the kitchen table until around 11, a stack of essays on the Constitutional Convention that ranged from excellent to someone, clearly describing the Constitutional Convention from a video game they'd played, when he finally gave up and went to bed. Sarah was already asleep, her red hair dark against the white pillow, her breathing slow and regular. He didn't check under the bed. He was 43 years old. He didn't check under the bed. But he did stand in the doorway for a moment before going in, just for a moment. He told himself it was because he was tired and wanted to look at something pleasant before sleeping. He told himself that. What he actually thought, and this is the part he took 8 months to tell anyone, was that the room looked wrong somehow. Not wrong in any definable way. The lamp was off. The curtains were drawn. Sarah was breathing. Everything was where it was supposed to be. But something felt like it was 1 degree off, like a photograph of a familiar room taken by a stranger's camera, identical in every detail and wrong in a way that the details don't account for. He went to bed. He slept. He woke at 3:17 a.m. to the sound of nothing and found himself looking at the corner of the bedroom near the closet and discovered with a calm that surprised him that the corner was occupied. He told himself it was a coat. This is important because the rationalization tells you something about Daniel Marsh. It tells you that he was, fundamentally, a man who wanted explanations. Not a credulous man. Sarah teased him about that, called him her personal mythbuster when she'd bring up something she'd read that struck her as interesting but implausible, and he'd spend 20 minutes fact-checking it on his phone while she watched him with patient, amused eyes. Not a fearful man, exactly, but a man with a deep structural preference for the world to make sense. A coat, he'd hung a coat on the closet doorknob. He'd forgotten. It was dark. The figure in the corner, darker than the darkness, he noticed, which was the thing about it. The way it seemed to absorb the ambient light of the street lamp coming in at the curtain's edge was about 6 feet tall, featureless. The shape was roughly human, which is to say it had a head and shoulders and a general verticality, but the details were absent in the way that shapes in darkness are usually absent, like a person standing just outside the edge of a photograph, like the negative space that your eye assembles into a face and then loses again every time you shift your gaze. He lay there, Daniel Marsh, high school history teacher, father, boyfriend, vegetable gardener, for approximately 30 seconds looking at this shape in the corner of his own bedroom. And he thought coat. He thought tired. He thought. The brain does things in the space between sleep and wakefulness. He'd read about that. Something about hypnagogic states. Something about the temporal lobe. He was a man who had read about things. Then he thought, but that coat doesn't have eyes. He couldn't have told you how he knew it was looking at him. There were no eyes, nothing he could point to and say, there, those are eyes, that's what I saw. It was faceless in the way that a certain kind of dream is faceless, where you know absolutely that a person in the dream is a specific person you know despite the fact that their face keeps changing or has never been clearly visible at all. He knew it was looking at him the way you know things in dreams, not because of evidence, because of something underneath evidence that arrives as certainty. He reached over and touched Sarah's shoulder. She stirred without waking. He looked back at the corner. The coat was hanging on the doorknob. There was nothing in the corner. He lay awake for a long time after that, listening to Sarah breathe, and to the furnace do its ancient grinding best, and to a dog barking 3 streets over at something the dog had decided was worth barking at. He didn't sleep again until almost 5. When he got up at 7 to make coffee, the morning was ordinary, gray, indistinguishable from any other February morning in Harlow, Maine. He almost didn't think about the corner at all. Almost. Because here's the thing about Daniel Marsh, the thing that makes his account different from 100 similar accounts I could give you, the thing I want you to carry through everything that follows. He was paying attention. He'd always been a paying attention kind of man. His students said that about him, in the way that students talk about good teachers, that he noticed things, that he remembered what you said, that he was hard to bullshit because he was genuinely, attentively listening to you. So when it happened again, 10 days later, same corner, same darkness, same terrible patient stillness, he was ready to pay attention. He just wasn't ready for what the attention would cost him. The second time he sat up. That was the difference. That was the thing he did differently. The first time he'd lain there doing his mental coach-rationalization, watching it resolve into nothing. The second time at 2:51 a.m. on a Thursday in late February, he heard himself say okay quietly in the dark, the kind of thing you say before a dentist appointment or a difficult conversation, and he sat up. It was still there. He'd expected, hoped, that the act of moving would break whatever spell the half-sleeping brain had cast on the shadows. That's what he told himself. This is my brain. This is the half-sleeping limbic system doing its ancient predator detection thing, seeing human shapes in random shadow formations the way the brain sees faces in clouds and wood grain and the pattern on a shower curtain. Pareidolia. That was another word he knew. He was a man who kept his vocabulary stocked against moments like this. The shape did not dissolve. It did not flicker or shimmer or do any of the things that a hallucination, as far as he understood hallucinations, ought to do. It simply stood, in the corner, between the closet and the window, about 6 feet tall, without clear edges but with an absolute definite presence the way a very large piece of furniture in a dark room has presence, not seen so much as sensed, taking up space with a weight that displaced the air around it. Sarah was on his left. He could feel her warmth, her breathing, the slight movement of the mattress when she exhaled. The figure was 8 feet away across the room. He sat upright in bed looking at it for what he later estimated as 2 minutes, though he admitted it might have been 30 seconds and might have been 10 minutes. Time does unreliable things in the 3 a.m. dark. It wasn't looking at him this time. It was looking at Sarah. He thought about this afterward. He thought about it at length in the daylight, sitting at his kitchen table with coffee he didn't drink while papers he wasn't grading sat in a pile beside him. He turned the thought over carefully, the way you turn an object over looking for the thing wrong with it. It was looking at Sarah. It was standing at her side of the room, not his, hers, and whatever that quality was, that attention quality he'd felt the first night directed at him, was now directed at her, at the back of her head, at the slow rise and fall of her breathing under the quilt his mother had made him decades ago. He reached over and turned on the bedside lamp. Nothing in the corner, nothing by the window, the room exactly as it should be, lamplit and ordinary and his, containing his things and his sleeping girlfriend and his quilt and no one else. Sarah opened her eyes, looked at him, said, "You okay?" And Daniel Marsh, paying attention man who didn't bullshit and didn't like being bullshitted, said, "Yeah, bad dream, go back to sleep." He told himself later that he'd said it to protect her. He believes that, I think. He might even be right. But there's another possibility, one he didn't mention until much later, in a conversation that had gone quiet and honest in the particular way that late conversations sometimes do. He didn't tell Sarah, because telling her would have made it real. And somewhere in Daniel Marsh, at 3 a.m. in Harlow, Maine, with the lamp on and the corner empty, there was a part of him that was not ready for that yet. The decision was the internet. That sounds mundane. Most wrong decisions sound mundane when you describe them from the outside. He went looking. This is what he did. This careful, skeptical man who fact-checked things on his phone and had a deep structural preference for the world to make sense. He went looking for what was happening to him. He typed, at 11 p.m. on a Sunday night with Sarah back in Brewer, and the house quiet and the thermostat at 67. Dark figure in corner of bedroom at night. And then, because he was who he was, sleep paralysis dark figure, and hypnagogic hallucination standing figure, and shadow person corner bedroom. The results came back. There were thousands of them. Not thousands of medical explanations, though those were there too, and he read every one, his teacher's brain highlighting terms like hypnagogic imagery and sleep, paralysis-associated hallucination and activation of the fusiform face area during REM transitions, and he read them with the careful hope of a man reading a diagnosis that he very much wants to apply to himself. There were also thousands of accounts, personal accounts, written in Reddit comment threads and paranormal forums and YouTube video comments and personal blogs that hadn't been updated in years, written by people across every conceivable demographic, every country he could identify by the spelling and idiom and cultural reference points embedded in their language. Every one of them described the same thing. Dark human-shaped watching. He sat with that for a long time. He sat with it the way you sit with something that hasn't resolved into meaning yet, but that has weight, that you can feel pressing against the inside of your chest like a question that wants to become something else. He found the forums. He started reading the testimony, not the paranormal speculation which he skipped, but the first-person accounts, the "this happened to me" posts from people who sounded, as far as he could tell through the screen, like sane and ordinary people. People with jobs and families and specificity. People who wrote the way people write when they're trying to describe something accurately rather than dramatically. Teachers and nurses and software engineers, and retired military and college students and grandmothers from Minnesota and teenagers from Glasgow, and a retired firefighter from Sao Paulo who'd written his account in careful, slightly formal English that suggested it was his third language, and he wanted to get it exactly right. All the same figure, all the same corner, all the same watching. Daniel Marsh closed his laptop at 1 a.m. He sat in the kitchen for a while. Then he made himself go to bed, his bed in his room, alone, and he lay in the dark, and he did not look at the corner by the closet, and this is what he thought. It knows her name. He didn't know where that thought came from. He'd had no evidence for it, no logical chain of reasoning leading to it. It arrived fully formed in the dark behind his eyes, and it sat there like a stone. He didn't sleep. And here is the part nobody talks about. The part left out of every news report, every official account, every interview. Because the people who knew, the ones who were actually there, made a decision. They decided some things were better left unsaid. They were wrong. And tonight, you're going to hear why. He told himself it was nothing. The house had been telling him the same thing for 3 weeks. Houses lie. Sarah noticed it on a Wednesday. Not the figure. She had not at this point seen the figure, and Daniel had not told her about the figure, and the figure, as far as either of them knew, had not appeared on any of Sarah's nights. She noticed something smaller. She noticed that the bedroom felt different at night. Not in any way she could have explained to anyone. She was a librarian. She was a precise, careful person with words, and she would have chosen the word different and then been dissatisfied with it. Because different wasn't quite right either. Different implies change, implies that something has been altered from a prior state. What Sarah felt, and she mentioned this to Daniel only once, and he said in a way that meant something, in a way that she filed away without knowing why, was not that the room had changed. It was that the room had always been like this, and she had not noticed until now. She began sleeping closer to his side of the bed. She didn't mention that. She told herself it was because February was cold, and she ran cold anyway. She put a glass of water on her bedside table before sleep, which she had never done before, and she told herself it was because she'd read somewhere that keeping hydrated improved sleep quality. The closet door began to bother her, specifically the fact that it was not fully closed. Daniel had a habit of leaving it open an inch, 2 inches, not through carelessness, but through some unconscious nocturnal reaching for a shirt or a robe and then not pushing it fully back. She'd noticed this before without minding. Now she found herself getting up after Daniel was asleep and closing it, all the way. Once she pushed it closed and heard the latch click and felt immediately better. She stood there in the dark for a moment with her hand on the cool wood of the door, and felt better in the specific way that you feel better when something that has been wrong for a while is briefly, partially fixed. She went back to bed. In the morning, the closet door was open again. She had not opened it. Daniel had not opened it. She was certain of this in a way she would not have been able to explain under direct questioning. Not certain in an irrational way, certain in the way that you are certain of small facts about your own body. She simply knew. The closet door had been closed when she fell asleep, and it was open in the morning, and there was no explanation she wanted to apply to this that didn't make the day feel different from that point on. She began leaving the lamp on, just the small one on her side of the bed, the one with the amber bulb that cast more glow than light, just enough to see the room by. Daniel didn't comment on this. She noticed that he didn't comment on it, that he seemed, if anything, relieved. They had dinner one Thursday, pasta, a glass of wine each, the news on in the background with the sound too low to hear clearly because neither of them really wanted to watch it, and she almost said, "The room is wrong at night." The sentence formed completely in her mind. She almost said it. She didn't. Some things, once said, cannot be taken back, and Sarah was a careful person. Daniel started checking the corners. He didn't tell himself he was doing it. He didn't frame it as that. He would come into a room, the kitchen in the morning, the living room in the evening, the bathroom at night, and his eyes would go, before anything else, to the corners, to the angles where walls meet walls, to the spaces where light doesn't reach even when all the lights are on, the geometric shadows produced by furniture and door frames, and the specific arrangement of a room that has been organized around human occupation rather than illumination. He wasn't looking for it. He told himself he wasn't looking for it. He was looking for it. His students noticed something. Not anything they could name, just a quality in his attention that had shifted. He was always attentive. That was the thing people said about him. But now the attention had an edge to it. He would pause mid-sentence in a lecture and glance toward the back of the classroom. toward the rear corners where the fluorescent lights buzzed and the darkness behind the overhead projector screen pooled, and then returned to what he'd been saying without acknowledging the pause. 3 of his students mentioned it in the same week to each other, in the way that teenagers compare observations about adults. "Have you noticed Mr. Marsh is weird lately?" One of them said, "He keeps looking at something that isn't there." Another said, "Maybe it's there and we just can't see it." They laughed. It was the kind of joke you make because the alternative is taking it seriously. Sarah stopped looking at the corner. This was the thing Daniel noticed and couldn't explain his reaction to, which was one of a dread so specific and so disproportionate to what he was observing that he sat with it for days. She'd always been a person who looked around a room when she woke up. A natural orientation behavior, the kind of thing most people do without knowing. A few seconds of taking in the space before the day begins. She'd done it every morning he'd watched her wake up for 8 months. She stopped. She woke up and looked at the ceiling and reached for his hand under the quilt and lay there for a long moment before getting up, and her eyes never moved to the corner by the closet. He didn't ask her why. She didn't volunteer it. And in the corner, if you had been there to see it, in the corner where the light from the amber lamp on Sarah's bedside table didn't quite reach, in the angle between the closet and the window, where the shadows pooled regardless of the season or the hour, something that had been there for 3 weeks continued, as it had always continued, to wait. It had been there before either of them moved in. What you just heard was only the beginning. There was a woman on the 2nd floor of Daniel's building. No, wait, he lived in a house. I need to be careful with the details now. Not Daniel's building, his street. There was a woman on his street named Mrs. Calloway, 71 years old, who had lived on Birch Road for 34 years. She kept a small garden she covered with burlap in winter. She left her porch light on every night, the only house on the block that did. Daniel met her at the mailbox in early March. She asked how he was settling in, which was a strange question since he'd lived there 4 years. He said fine. She looked at him for a moment with the look that very old people sometimes have, that look of being simultaneously in the present conversation and somewhere else entirely, some other conversation, some other version of this one they've already had, and she said, "Do you sleep well in that house?" He said yes. She nodded, not as though she believed him, as though she'd expected him to say that. She turned back to her mailbox. Then, without turning around again, "It bothers them, the light. Doesn't stop them, but it bothers them. You might try it." And she took her mail inside and closed her door, and her porch light, alone on the dark street, kept on burning. Daniel stood at the mailbox for a while. He went home. He turned on the porch light. He had never turned on the porch light before, had considered it vaguely wasteful, and he stood in the entryway for a moment looking at the warm circle it cast on the front step. He didn't feel better. He felt like a man who has just learned that the thing he assumed was only his is actually known to other people, and that the knowing of other people makes it real in a way his private fear had not quite managed. He made dinner, he graded papers, he went to bed. He woke at 3:04 a.m. The corner by the closet was empty. The figure was standing by the window. She noticed it on a Tuesday. 3 days later, it had a name in a police report, and that report, document number HF 198347, filed in Harlow County, archived and technically public, practically unreachable, was not the first one, not by decades. March 3 RD 1983, 2:17 a.m., HARLOW, Maine. Officer Doug Pelletier responded to a disturbance call on Birch Road. The caller, a 34-year-old named Michael Greer, reported an intruder in his bedroom. Pelletier arrived in 6 minutes. Greer was outside on the front step in his underwear and a winter coat, barefoot in 8 inches of snow. He was not visibly injured. He would not go back inside. His statement, which is in the record, describes a figure approximately 6 feet tall, completely black, standing by his bedroom window. He stated it had no face. He stated it was watching his wife, who was asleep. He stated, and Pelletier, a 20-year veteran, wrote this down without comment, that the figure turned its head when Greer got up, that it looked at him, that it moved without walking from the window to the foot of the bed in a way that he described as sliding. He ran. His wife, Patricia Greer, heard nothing, saw nothing, slept through the event and through the police visit and through her husband's subsequent refusal to return to the bedroom. She told Pelletier she was a heavy sleeper. Pelletier noted that she appeared calm and showed no signs of distress. The Greers moved out of Birch Road within a month. Patricia Greer, Harlow resident, 1983, interviewed 2004 by paranormal researcher J. Elwood. I know what Mike said. I know what he wrote in that statement. I want you to understand Mike was a rational man. He'd done 2 tours in Vietnam. He wasn't the kind of man who scared easy or who made things up. When he told me what he saw, I believed him. I believed him because of the way his hands were shaking, not from the cold. The hands that had been in Vietnam were shaking from standing in his own bedroom for 30 seconds in February. Patricia Greer died in 2007. Michael Greer has not commented publicly since 1984. This is not an isolated incident. January 14, 1978, the same street. A woman named Carol Ashworth, 28, called Harlow PD to report a prowler. The responding officer found her locked in her car in the driveway. She described a dark figure in the upstairs bedroom. Her husband, asleep upstairs, was unharmed and had observed nothing. February 27, 2001. A college student house sitting on Birch Road filed a complaint describing a shadow figure in the guest bedroom. He described it as perfectly still, like a cutout of a person, except it was darker than the room around it. He left the house at approximately 4 a.m. and returned the following morning only to collect his things. He declined to complete the house sit. Harlow Road, same location. 3 separate incidents spanning 23 years. 4 if you count Daniel Marsh. 5 if you count what Mrs. Calloway saw the winter of 1969, before any of them moved there. November 19th, 2011, Portland, Oregon. Registered nurse Amanda Holt, 41, began experiencing nightly visitations at approximately 3 a.m. She had no prior psychiatric history. She was not on medication that would produce hallucinations. She was, by all clinical accounts, a healthy adult woman with a demanding job and a tendency toward insomnia unrelated to what she would subsequently experience. The figure appeared on night 1. It appeared on night 2. On night 7, it appeared while her 8-year-old daughter, Zoe, was sleeping in Amanda's bed after a nightmare. Amanda Holt, a registered nurse who had worked 11 years in the ICU and had seen things that would have destroyed people with less professional discipline, got between the figure and her daughter. She stood in the dark in her own bedroom and put herself between her sleeping child and the figure in the corner. She described this in her statement to Dr. Vivian Cross at OHSU Sleep Medicine in December 2011. Amanda Holt, RN, Portland, Oregon, December 2011. I know how this sounds. I know exactly how this sounds. I'm a nurse. I understand what sleep disorders look like and what they don't look like, and I am telling you I was awake. I had been awake for 40 minutes reading. I put the book down. I turned off the light. I lay there for maybe 5 minutes. I was not asleep. I was not transitioning in or out of sleep. I was awake in the way that you are awake right now, and it was there. And I got up and I stood between it and Zoe because I am her mother and that is what you do. And it looked at me. And I want you to note in whatever you're writing down that I was not frightened in the way that I expected. I was afraid. But underneath the fear was something else. Something that felt like recognition. Like it wasn't surprised to see me. Like it had been expecting me to get up. Amanda Holt was referred for polysomnographic study. All sleep metrics were within normal parameters. She was diagnosed with isolated sleep paralysis despite the fact that she described being, at the time of the event, fully ambulatory. She did not return to Dr. Cross's practice. She moved to a different apartment 2 months later. The visitations moved with her. That last fact is documented. That last fact is the one that the diagnostic category of sleep paralysis cannot accommodate. It moved with her. The shadow figure has a name in every culture that has encountered it long enough to develop one. The Newfoundland English-speaking communities call it the old hag, the figure that sits on the chest of the sleeping person and steals their breath. Dr. David Hufford at the University of Pennsylvania spent 30 years studying this tradition. His 1982 book, The Terror That Comes in the Night, documented 93 first-person accounts from Newfoundland alone, cross-referenced against accounts from Nigeria, China, Japan, St. Lucia, Canada, and the United States. The figure across all cultures shares three invariant characteristics: darkness, upright humanoid form, and the act of observation. It watches. It has always watched. The Hmong of Laos call it Sog Tsuwen, the nightmare presser. When Hmong refugees resettled in the United States between 1975 and 1985, a phenomenon that researchers called SUNDS, sudden unexplained nocturnal death syndrome, killed 117 otherwise healthy adult men in their sleep. The deaths clustered in the newly resettled communities. The men had been reporting the figure before they died. The official determination was cardiac arrhythmia. No cause for the arrhythmia was identified in any of the 117 cases. 117 men, all previously healthy, all reporting the same figure, all dead. Dr. Shelley Adler, medical anthropologist, UCSF, 2011. The relationship between the sleep paralysis entity experience and the actual fatalities is one of the most disturbing documented patterns in the literature. We have arrhythmias, we have the figure, we have cultural belief as a possible mechanism, the physiological terror response creating the cardiac event. But I want to be precise. We cannot rule out the alternative, which is that the figure itself causes something. Current status of the Hmong SUNDS cases, officially closed. Cause, unknown. Current status of the shadow figure reports globally, ongoing. The American Sleep Association estimates that 40% of the population will experience at least one hypnagogic hallucination in their lifetime. Of those, a consistent and documented subset, running at approximately 35% across all studies, describe the same figure. Not a vague presence, not an unnamed darkness. A figure, human-shaped, standing, watching. The most recent study, published in the journal Sleep in October 2022, surveyed 8,400 respondents across 27 countries. The shadow figure described by respondents showed less than 4% variation in reported characteristics across national, cultural, and demographic boundaries. Less than 4% variation. You would not accept less than 4% variation as coincidence in any other context. What I am about to tell you is documented. It is on record. It exists in files that are technically public but practically inaccessible. I found them. I read every page. You need to hear what is inside, because what happened once is still happening. The file ends there. What it cannot record is what happened inside Daniel Marsh's chest when he read it, the specific weight of knowing that someone had survived this before him and told no one, that it had followed a woman from one apartment to another like a dog that had chosen its owner, that 117 men had died, that the file on all of it was technically closed. He printed everything. This is the kind of detail that tells you where a person is at. Daniel Marsh, who had not printed a physical document since about 2015, because the printer in the study gave him nothing but grief and required a specific sequence of buttonholes to convince it to work, went into the study and coaxed the printer into life and printed 63 pages of research and documentation and case files and forum posts and academic journal excerpts and the David Hufford study abstract and the SUNDS data table. He put them in a manila folder. He labeled the folder in pencil. The label said, Research. He put the folder in the bottom drawer of his desk, under old tax returns from 2019, and a broken watch he kept meaning to get repaired. He did not tell Sarah. By the 3rd week of March, the 6th week of visitations, as he'd started privately calling them, the routine had established itself in the way that terrible routines do. He'd wake somewhere between 2:45 and 3:30 a.m. He'd lie still for a moment with his eyes closed, running through what he now thought of as the inventory. Am I actually awake? Yes. Is the room familiar? Yes. Is Sarah breathing? Yes. He developed a whole check-in process, internal and precise, by which he determined the state of his own consciousness before opening his eyes. He recognized, with the particular self-awareness of a man who'd started Googling cognitive behavioral approaches to sleep phobia, that this check-in process was itself a form of the problem. He'd open his eyes. The figure would be there, in the corner or by the window or, and this was new, this had started 2 weeks ago and he liked it the least, at the foot of the bed, just standing there, in the posture that he'd come to think of, helplessly, as patient, like something that was not in any hurry because hurry implied time mattering, and time, for the figure, did not appear to matter. He couldn't leave. That was the thing he hadn't expected, the thing that differentiated his experience from Michael Greer's, who had simply walked out the door and stood in the snow. He didn't want to leave, not because he wasn't frightened, he was. A low, constant hum of fear that had become so regular he'd stopped fully registering it, the way people who live near train tracks stop hearing trains, not because some supernatural force was pinning him to the bed, because of Sarah. He wasn't going to leave Sarah in the room with it. He thought about this. He thought about what it said, what it told him about the situation, that he was lying there in the dark next to his sleeping girlfriend, making himself stay because he'd made some unconscious decision that his presence was somehow protected. Against what? He couldn't articulate it. He couldn't point to anything the figure had done that was directly threatening to Sarah. It stood. It watched. That was all. But something about the way it watched her made him feel that leaving the room would be abandonment. That word specifically. He'd sat with that for a while. He started sleeping lighter, the way animals sleep when something is nearby. He stopped mentioning to Sarah that he was tired. The weekend of March 20th, Emma came to stay. 9 years old and a gap-toothed smile and a horse phase that showed no signs of abating. She arrived Friday evening with a duffel bag containing approximately 6 stuffed horses, 2 books, and what appeared to be the world's largest collection of horse-themed socks. She was, in the way that children are sometimes with the people their parents are dating, immediately and warmly fond of Sarah, and Sarah was immediately and warmly fond of her, and Daniel stood in his own kitchen watching them argue cheerfully about whether it was faster to braid or to style, and felt something he hadn't felt in 6 weeks. Normal. Completely, unreservedly, uncomplicated normal. Emma slept in the study, where Daniel had carefully ensured there was nothing in the bottom drawer of the desk that a 9-year-old should see. She reported the next morning that she'd slept great. Daniel watched her eat cereal and describe a dream about a horse that could also do math, and felt relief. Something as physical as setting down a weight he'd been carrying long enough that his muscles had forgotten they were working. That night, with Emma in the study and Sarah asleep beside him, he watched the corner by the closet for 20 minutes. Nothing. He checked the window. Nothing. The foot of the bed. Nothing. He lay there in the dark smiling, which felt strange and good, and he thought, maybe it's over. He thought, maybe it's been over for a while and I didn't notice because I was so busy waiting for it. He thought about the manila folder in the bottom drawer and thought he should probably throw it away. He thought about Mrs. Calloway and thought he should probably wave when he saw her at the mailbox and not make it weird. He closed his eyes. He was almost asleep when Sarah made a sound. Not a scream, nothing so dramatic as a scream. A small, short, involuntary sound. A sound the body makes when it has been startled by something before the mind has caught up. The kind of sound you make if someone taps your shoulder unexpectedly in a quiet room. He opened his eyes. Sarah was sitting up, looking toward the study. Down the hall, the study door, which he had carefully, specifically, definitively closed before going to bed, was open. From the study, very quietly, in the small voice that Emma used when she was trying not to be a bother about something. "Daddy." He was out of bed and down the hall before he'd consciously decided to move. He was in the doorway of the study, and his daughter was sitting up on the fold-out couch with 6 stuffed horses arranged around her like a small cavalry, and her eyes were very wide, and she was looking at the corner of the study, and he looked at the corner of the study, and the corner was empty, and he went to her and she said, very quietly, there was someone standing there. He told her it was a dream. He held her and said it was a dream. The way you say things to children that you need to be true badly enough that the saying feels close to making them true. He said, you were still asleep and you saw something in the dream and it felt real because that's how dreams work sometimes. He said this in his steady teacher's voice, the one that meant he was in control of the situation even when he was not. Emma pressed her face into his shoulder and said, it wasn't a dream. Dreams feel very real sometimes, he said. Daddy, she said, in the tone children use when they need you to stop using your adult voice and just listen. I know the difference between being asleep and being awake. He sat with her until she fell back asleep, which took a long time, and which he spent sitting on the floor beside the fold-out couch with his back against the wall, watching the corner by the bookshelf, watching the corner by the door, watching the small gap between the curtains where the streetlight came through. Nothing came. He went back to his own bedroom at some point before dawn. Sarah was awake. She'd been awake the whole time, he realized, lying in the dark. She looked at him when he came in. She looked at him with a face from which she'd removed the careful, protective composure that he'd come to understand she maintained most of the time around him. And he thought, she's been maintaining that composure since February. I've been seeing it too, she said. She said it very simply, in the way that you say something you've been holding for a long time, not with drama, because the holding of it has worn the drama out, left only the plain fact. Not every night, she said. Not always in the corner, sometimes by the window, once at the foot of the bed on your side. He was going to ask why she hadn't told him. He was going to say the obvious thing, the thing that you say, which is, why didn't you tell me? He opened his mouth. It's watching you, she said. When it's on your side, it's standing over you and watching your face while you sleep. And I haven't been able to figure out if it's better or worse that you're asleep when it does. He closed his mouth. Down the hall in the study, Emma made a small sleeping sound. One of her stuffed horses fell off the couch. The closet door was open an inch. He had closed it before bed. What you just heard was only the beginning. He drove Emma home the next morning without mentioning any of it. She'd woken up subdued in the way of children who have decided not to make trouble about something, and he'd made pancakes and she'd eaten them, and asked if she could come back next weekend, and he'd said of course, with a smile that he was somewhat amazed didn't visibly require effort. After he dropped her off, he sat in the truck in his ex-wife's driveway for a while. His ex-wife was named Janet, and she was a good person, and their marriage had ended for reasons that were mutual and sad, and had nothing to do with anyone being bad at it. He thought about calling her and telling her not to send Emma to Birch Road until this was resolved. He thought about how that conversation would go. He thought about the word resolve and what resolution would even look like, and he sat in the truck in Janet's driveway until the cold worked its way through the windows. He drove home. Sarah was in the kitchen when he got back. She'd been there since he left. He could tell she had the look of someone who has been sitting very still thinking about something for a long time. She had a cup of tea she'd stopped drinking. She looked up when he came in and said, "We need to talk about it." So they talked. They talked for 3 hours at the kitchen table, which was, in Daniel's experience, 3 times longer than either of them had ever talked about anything. They talked in the careful, specific way that people talk when they've been holding something back, and are now determined to get it exactly right. Sarah described what she'd seen, where it stood when it stood there, the quality of attention it directed at him. Daniel described what he'd seen, where it stood when it stood there, the quality of attention it directed at her. They compared notes. It was, he thought, the strangest thing he'd ever done, sitting at his kitchen table in March in Maine with the woman he was fairly certain he loved. Comparing notes on the thing that watched them sleep. The thing that emerged from their comparison was this. It was never watching both of them at the same time. Always one, then the other, on different nights, in a pattern that had a rhythm they hadn't perceived individually, but that, laid out side by side, was as regular as breathing. It was taking turns. That was the last ordinary thought either of them would have for a long time. Not the last thought, just the last one that felt like it belonged to a world that still made simple, navigable sense. That was the last normal thought he would have. I do not use the word normal lightly. I use it the way one might use the word sure while watching it disappear behind you. I must speak now of the mind, specifically, of what happens to a mind that has been looking too long at something that cannot be explained. There is a term. I know the term, I have studied the term. The term is rumination disorder, and it is a perfectly respectable diagnosis for a perfectly respectable category of cognitive dysfunction in which the mind returns, without volition, again and again, to a specific thought or image or question that it cannot resolve. The therapy for it involves something called cognitive diffusion, learning to observe one's thoughts rather than inhabit them, to hold them at arm's length, to say there is the thought again rather than simply thinking it without distance or perspective. I had been a rational man. I want that on the record. But here is the thing about rationality, the thing that the cognitive diffusion worksheets do not perhaps fully address. Rationality is a tool, and like any tool, it requires a stable hand. And the hand, which is to say the mind, which is to say the self, which is to say the particular arrangement of memory and experience and interpretation and identity that constitutes the person doing the thinking. The hand had begun, by this point in my investigation, to tremble. Was it the accounts, 6,000 of them now that I had read? Was it the consistency, that terrible, beautiful, damning consistency that made no neurological sense? Was it the Hmong men, dead in their beds, the figure preceding each death? Was it the simple fact that I had begun, in the past month, waking between 2 and 3 in the morning for no reason, lying in the dark of my apartment in Edinburgh, with my heart doing something technical and unpleasant in my chest, listening to the specific quality of silence that a room has when you are not alone in it? Was it real? Was any of it real? I am a researcher. I live by the principle that the question must precede the answer, that methodology, not hope, determines truth. And yet I found myself, at 3 in the morning in Edinburgh, asking not what the evidence suggested, but what I preferred to be true. Because the evidence, the accumulated, documented, cross-cultural, statistically significant evidence, suggested something for which I had no methodology. Something for which methodology itself was insufficient. The figures were consistent, they were ancient, they were everywhere. And now, I was waking at 3 in the morning. And the corner of my bedroom in the dark had begun to feel occupied. I have been meticulous in my documentation of what I am about to confess to you. Every date, every notation, every detail recorded in a journal I keep locked. Why do I keep it locked? I live alone. There is no one to read it, and yet I keep it locked. This itself should tell you something. March the 4th. I recorded this, woke at 3:11, bedroom dark. The corner by the wardrobe, the large one, the mahogany one I brought from my father's house, occupied. I wrote that. Occupied. Not appeared to contain a figure, not something seemed to be there. Words I would have used 3 months ago. Careful researchers' words designed to preserve distance from the claim. I wrote occupied because that was the most accurate word. and I had by March the 4th run out of patience for inaccurate words. March the 9th, woke 2:58. It is at the foot of the bed. It has been at the foot of the bed 4 times now. I do not know what that change in position signifies. I am deeply, too deeply afraid to find out. March the 17th. I was on the phone with Dr. Carver in Edinburgh discussing the variance data, and I looked up from my notes in the corner of my office. My office, in daylight at 11 in the morning, was occupied. I stared. Dr. Carver was speaking about statistical methodology. The corner resolved, or perhaps the thing in it departed. I cannot determine which, and I returned to the conversation. I did not mention it. This is when I understood, truly understood, not academically but in the way that changes a person, what all those accounts meant. All 6,000 accounts, all those ordinary people writing in their careful, ordinary language about the thing in the corner. I had read them as data, as inputs, as evidence toward a conclusion. They were confessions. Every one of them. A confession from someone who had tried to hold onto their rationality with both hands, and felt it shifting under the pressure of something that should not be real and demonstrably was. If you are still with me, if you have not yet turned away, write in the comments. The walls remember. Let me know I am not alone in this. Because that question, the question of whether any of us is alone in this, is the question that I cannot stop asking. In the dark, at 3 in the morning, while the corner decides what it is tonight. What it is never entirely clear. That it is no longer something I can dispute. I have read the neuroscience. I have read all of it, every paper, every study, every clinical account of the hypnagogic state and the mechanisms of the fusiform gyrus and the temporal lobe's role in face detection, and the way the paralysis of REM extends briefly beyond sleep. I know all of this. I assembled this literature myself. I cited it in papers. I believed it. I believed it the way you believe in a lock before someone demonstrates it can be picked. The mechanism, yes. Let us grant the mechanism. Let us say that the brain, in the transition between sleep and waking, activates the face detection module, the predator presence module, the threat assessment system that kept our ancestors alive on the savannah for 2 million years. Let us say that this ancient hair trigger system generates, in the hypnagogic moment, the image of a standing watcher. Let us accept this entirely. It does not explain the pattern. It does not explain why 4% or less variation exists across unconnected individuals with no shared culture. It does not explain the accounts that occur in full wakefulness, and there are hundreds of them, hundreds. I have read every one. It does not explain Amanda Holt, a trained ICU nurse, ambulatory, who stood between the figure and her daughter. It does not explain why it followed her when she moved. It does not explain why it is always the same posture, the same watching, the same patience that isn't human patience because human patience has a limit and this does not. Do you understand what I am saying to you? I am not asking you to believe in the paranormal. I am asking you to sit with the data, just the numbers, just the clinical accounts of trained professionals in multiple countries spanning multiple decades, and tell me whether the explanation we have been given is sufficient. Whether the brain misfires accounts for something this consistent, this ancient, this everywhere. I can no longer convince myself that it does. And the reason, the specific, documentary, personal reason, is this. My colleague Dr. Carver visited me in Edinburgh last week. We had dinner, we discussed the study, he stayed late. And when he left, he said, at the door with his coat on and his bag on his shoulder, the way you say things that you've decided to say before you lose your nerve, he said. I've been seeing it too, in my apartment, for 2 months. I didn't want to tell you because I didn't want to infect the research. And then he left. And I closed the door. And I stood in my hallway for a very long time. And I did not look at the corner. But do not for one moment believe that you are simply listening to a story. What I am telling you is real. It has always been real. And the reason I know this, the reason I cannot stop, is that it is still happening. Right now. as I speak these words to you in the dark. And so my mind, what remained of it, turned at last to the question I had been circling for days. Not what had I seen, but what precisely had seen me. To speak of what the shadow figures are, what they truly, fundamentally, primordially are, as opposed to what we experience them as, requires first that we abandon the comfortable provincial assumption that the universe was constructed at a scale appropriate to human comprehension. It was not. The universe is approximately 13.8 billion years old. The Earth is 4.5 billion. Multicellular life has existed for approximately 600 million years. Homo sapiens as a distinct species have been present for perhaps 300,000 years. Writing the entire enterprise of recorded human knowledge, everything we have documented and studied and built upon, every paper and book and journal and scripture and archive that constitutes the sum of human understanding, exists for approximately 5,000 years. 5,000 years in a universe 13.8 billion years old. The point is not to depress you. The point is to establish the temporal framework within which the shadow figures exist, because they are not a recent phenomenon and they are not a human one. And any attempt to understand them through the lens of human experience, human fear, human perception, human neuroscience, will fail for the simple reason that the lens was not ground to accommodate this particular object. What we call shadow people, the dark, standing, watching shapes reported by 40% of the global population at some point in their lives, demonstrating less than 4% variation across all cultural and geographical contexts, appear to interact with sleeping or near-sleeping human beings. This we know. What we have not asked, what the entire framework of sleep research has systematically declined to ask, is why sleeping? What is present in the sleeping human that is not present when we are awake? Dr. Mara Vanthorpe, Consciousness Studies, Stockholm University, 2020. Sleep is not the absence of consciousness. It is a different configuration of consciousness, one in which the filtering mechanisms we use to navigate consensus reality are significantly reduced or absent. If there are phenomena that exist outside the bandwidth of ordinary waking perception, sleep would be precisely when they would become visible. We dismiss this possibility not because the evidence contra indicates it, but because we are uncomfortable with what the evidence might indicate if we took it seriously. Dr. Vanthorpe retired from Stockholm University in 2021, following what she described in a brief public statement as a period of health-related reconsideration. She has not published since. The figures watch the sleeping. They have always watched the sleeping. They were watching the sleeping before humanity had a name for sleep, before we understood it as a state, before we built beds or had rooms or had any category more refined than night to describe the time when consciousness shifts and something in the dark leans closer. And the question I have been building toward for 19 sections of what began as research and has become something else, is not whether they are real. The question is what they want. What I am about to describe cannot be fully described. I want to be honest about that limitation before I attempt to transgress it. The accounts, all 6,000 of them, and the thousands I have encountered since, and the tens of thousands more that exist in languages I do not read, converge on a specific quality that witnesses struggle, uniformly and across every language and cultural framework, to articulate. The figure is dark. Yes, it is human-shaped. Yes, it watches. Yes. But there is something in these accounts, beneath the physical description, that the physical description alone does not capture, and which every witness attempts to express and none quite manages. It is the sense of age. Not age as in old, not the oldness of a human being at the end of a long life. Something categorically different, the oldness of a mountain, of a geological stratum, of something that has existed so long that the concept of time, as it applies to the figure, has simply become irrelevant. Witnesses say, it felt ancient. They say it felt like it had always been there. They say, and this is the phrase that appears most consistently, in the most varied of linguistic formulations, that standing in its presence felt like being observed by something that had no concept of you as a continuous, temporally existing being. That you were, to it, not a person encountering it, but a very brief local condition, like weather. Several witnesses have described feeling in the presence of the figure that their own consciousness was somehow peripheral, not threatened by the figure, not the targeted, personal menace of a predator, but irrelevant to it in the way that a candle flame is irrelevant to the sun. There, but not the point. I find this description, and I report it precisely because I find it the most disturbing in the entire literature, the most accurate one, because it suggests something for which no human framework has prepared us. Not malevolence, not supernatural evil in the theological sense, not a demon or an entity that has chosen humanity as an adversary for comprehensible reasons. Something that watches us the way we might watch the movement of water, with attention that is complete and genuine, and utterly without the attribution of significance. We watch. We are interesting perhaps in the way that interesting things are interesting. We are not important. This is what the figures teach. This is what the figures have always been teaching. And the tragedy, the specifically human tragedy, the one that no other species on this planet is equipped to suffer in this precise form, is that we are the only creatures capable of understanding this lesson. And understanding it changes nothing. There are warnings in the record. This is what I need you to understand before we proceed. There have always been warnings. The Lakota Sioux have a tradition, not a myth, a specific practical warning passed between medicine people that describes entities they call Kapasapa, the Black Watchers, and which advises that they should never be acknowledged, never looked at directly, never spoken of in the dark. Not because acknowledgement gives them power, the tradition does not claim this, but because acknowledgement, once made, establishes a relationship that cannot be unmade. You have recognized them. They have noted the recognition. Something has changed between you that was not changed before. The Christian mystic tradition has buried in its margins references to the Tenebrae vigils, the Dark Watchers, and similar practical warnings. Do not acknowledge. Do not engage. Move through the experience with your attention directed elsewhere, and it will pass. The framing is theological. These are entities whose attention is not desired for reasons the tradition declines to enumerate, but the practical instruction is identical to the Lakota one. Different culture, different century, same warning. The Egyptian Book of the Dead, which is concerned primarily with navigation of the afterlife, contains a passage that most scholars interpret as metaphorical, but which a small number of Egyptologists, working outside the mainstream, have argued is practical in nature. It advises the deceased to walk past certain figures without acknowledgement, without eye contact, without the error of supposing that the absence of visible eyes means the absence of sight, without the error of supposing that the absence of visible eyes means the absence of sight. I have made a list of all the things I should not have done in the course of this research. It is a longer list than I am comfortable sharing in full, but the relevant item, the one that brought me to where I am now, which is sitting in my Edinburgh apartment at 3:20 in the morning with every light in the flat on, writing this, is this. I acknowledged one 3 months ago in a hotel room in Portland, Oregon. I woke at 3 a.m. to find the figure standing at the foot of the bed, and instead of doing what every tradition from every culture across 6,000 years of human testimony advised, instead of ignoring it, looking elsewhere, waiting for the hypnagogic moment to pass, I looked at it. I looked at it directly. I said, in the empty hotel room, in a voice that surprised me with its steadiness, "I know you're there." It turned its head. What you just heard was only the beginning. I have tried to determine, in the months since, what the turning of the head signified. I have tried to do this with the tools of a researcher, dispassionately, methodically, with the assumption that meaning can be extracted from evidence if the evidence is examined with sufficient care. It is the assumption that has sustained 11 years of professional work. It is an assumption I am no longer entirely confident in. What I believe, and I use believe advisedly as a researcher, because I am aware that belief and evidence are not synonymous, and that the conflation of the two is the most common error in the study of anomalous experience. What I believe is that the turning of the head was not a response to my words. I do not think the figure processed my language and generated a motor response as a result that would attribute to it the kind of sequential cause and effect cognition that might apply to a human awareness. I think instead that the figure turned because the act of acknowledgement had altered something in the space between us. Not in the figure, not in me exactly, in the relation. The figure had been for the duration of its watch, whatever that watch represented, whatever it was for oriented toward me as a sleeping thing. A thing in the state that makes us visible to them. And when I spoke, I was no longer that. I was awake, oriented, aware. What the turning of the head meant was this. It noticed that I had noticed. That is all. That is the complete extent of what I can say with confidence. It noticed that I had noticed, and the noticing altered what I was to it, and the alteration was sufficient to make it turn its head. What that means for everything that has followed, for the nightly visits that have continued, uninterrupted, since Portland, for the change in the way the visits feel, the qualitative shift from observed to acknowledged, from anonymous to known, for the fact that my colleague Dr. Carver, who I told about the Portland incident in a moment of professional openness, I have subsequently reported 3 weeks later that his visits had also changed. For all of this, I do not have sufficient language. And I am a man who has devoted his adult life to developing sufficient language. What has been described thus far represents only the outermost fragment of the truth, the portion that human language can approximate. What lies beneath that layer, what the deepest accounts suggest, is something for which no preparation is adequate. Nothing that follows can be unheard. You were warned. Enough of the theoretical, but not yet enough of the visceral. There is one final psychological threshold to cross first. The question is not what I had done. The question is what I had become in acknowledging it. And that question requires a different voice. I began looking for it in the daytime. This is where I crossed the line that I had not known was a line until I had crossed it. I know this now. I know it with the clarity that comes after. But in the moment, in the long middle section of those months between Portland and now, I could not have told you where the line was or that I was approaching it. I could only tell you that the work had become something other than research. I was looking for it. In Edinburgh during the day, walking to the university along the Royal Mile, I looked at doorways, not deliberately, not consciously. My eyes went to doorways the way the tongue goes to a sore tooth, compulsively, reflexively, without instruction. They went to the angles of buildings, to the space under bridges, to the interiors of parked cars when I passed too close to see in. I looked for the shape. I looked for the darkness, that is darker than dark, the specific quality of presence without feature that I had memorized over 6,000 accounts, and then memorized again in my own bedroom in the specific way you memorize a face. I do not think it is present during daylight. The accounts do not support daytime visitation. In 11 years of research, I have found fewer than 20 claims of daytime encounters, and those are outliers that I would, prior to Portland, have categorized as pathological. I still believe this, technically. But I was looking. I couldn't stop looking. Sarah Daniels, who had become, in the months of my investigation, something closer to a research partner than a subject, called me in April. We spoke for an hour. She described a change in Daniel. He had begun, she said, checking the corners of rooms. Not at night. During the day, at school, in his truck, in the grocery store. She said he did it quickly, almost invisibly, but she had noticed because she had begun doing it too. We're looking for it, she said. I know, I said. There was a long pause. Is that what happens?" she asked. "Is that part of it? You start looking and then you can't stop looking." I did not tell her that I had been looking for 8 weeks, that I had crossed into obsession so gradually I had not identified the moment of crossing, that the research journal I locked was now filled not with clinical notation, but with something else, something more urgent and personal and less disciplined, something that read, when I forced myself to look at it clearly, less like science and more like confession. "Yes," I said, "that appears to be part of it." "Does it get better?" she asked. Let me tell you what I did not tell Sarah. Let me tell you what I have told no one, because telling no one felt like a category of protection, as though the thing could not know what I had done if I kept the doing of it perfectly interior and perfectly dark and perfectly mine. This is, I recognize, irrational. I recognize this clearly. Irrational beliefs, magical thinking about containment through secrecy, are not the province of rational men. They are the province of men who have already, quietly and without fanfare, stopped being as rational as they believed themselves to be. I had begun to talk to it. Not in Portland, not that night, not that once. After Portland, in Edinburgh, in my flat, I would wake and it would be there. And where previously I had lain silent, watching it, I had started, in a voice barely above a whisper, speaking to it. Not questions. I learned quickly that questions produced a specific quality of response, which was the worst quality, the quality of the figure being absolutely. Certainly not a thing that answers questions, not words of greeting or acknowledgement. I had learned what acknowledgement could do. I told it things. In the dark, between 2 and 4 in the morning, I told it what I had found, the accounts, the patterns, the 4% variance, the Hmong deaths, the Lakota warning and the Egyptian warning and the medieval Christian warning, and the fact that every culture that had encountered it long enough to develop a response had arrived at the same response. Do not acknowledge. Do not engage. Look elsewhere and wait. I had not looked elsewhere. I had engaged. And now I told it things in the dark because something in me had decided, had committed, past the point of retrieval, that if I was going to share a bedroom with this thing for the rest of my observable future, I might as well talk. I do not know if it listened. I do not know what listening would look like, for a thing that has no ears that I can see. I know that on the nights I talked, it stayed longer than on the nights I was silent. I know this because I noted it, because I noted everything still, the researcher's reflex outlasting the researcher. The last thing that remained of who I had been, nodding everything in the dark. There is something I have been avoiding saying. I am aware of this. I am aware that the avoidance has been visible, that a careful listener will have felt it, the way you feel the shape of something that is not being mentioned, the way you sense the presence of the name that keeps almost being spoken. Sarah asked me in that April call whether looking for it made it worse. She used those words exactly. Does looking for it make it worse? And I said yes, I believed it did, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she said very carefully, "Have you thought about stopping? The research, all of it. Have you thought about just walking away?" I said yes. I said I had thought about it extensively. This was not entirely accurate. I had thought about it in the way you think about an idea that is genuinely impossible. Not the way you think about difficult things that might still be done with enough discipline and courage, but the way you think about alternatives that you understand, at some level below argument, are not real alternatives, because the research had become, by that point, not something I was doing, but something I was. This is the confession I have been building toward through 25 sections of careful approach. Not that the figures are real. The evidence for that is beyond my personal testimony now, that I leave to the data. Not that I acknowledged one and altered something between us. Not that I began looking for it during the day, or talking to it in the dark, or filling pages with something that looked less like science every week. The confession is this: I do not want to stop. I am afraid of them. I have been afraid for months. That fear is real and continuous, and has cost me sleep and professional focus. and a significant portion of the equanimity I had built over a careful adult lifetime. And there is something in the watching that I have come to need. Something in being the object of an attention that is ancient and vast and completely beyond the personal. An attention that has watched the sleeping since before humanity had language to describe the sleep. That I have found, in the way the most disturbing things sometimes do, a terrible comfort in. It sees me. It has always seen me. Whatever it sees when it looks at me, whether that seeing contains anything analogous to recognition, to categorization, to the tiniest shadow of something we might call understanding, I cannot determine. But it sees me. And for a man who has spent 11 years in a room alone with data, that is a harder thing to give up than it should be. Enough of the theoretical, enough of the academic distance. What was found in that room deserves to be described as it was, in full, in light, with nothing hidden. Let us talk about what it does to the body. Not metaphorically, not phenomenologically, not in the careful distance of clinical language or the poetic approximation of literary horror. Let us talk about what the body experiences, physiologically, in the presence of the figure. Because the body keeps its own record, one more honest than the mind's, and the body's record is available to us in the form of the studies that no one reads at conferences because the numbers make people uncomfortable. In the presence of the figure, cortisol levels spike to values associated with life-threatening emergency. The adrenal response is maximum, not the moderate stress cortisol of a difficult day, not the elevated cortisol of a bad nightmare. The full fight-or-flight activation of a human body that believes it is about to die. The heart rate increases to between 140 and 180 beats per minute. The pupils dilate fully. Perspiration begins within seconds. The muscles of the legs, specifically, show electrodermal activity consistent with preparation for running, even in witnesses who describe being completely unable to move. The body wants to run. The body is screaming run in the language of adrenaline and cortisol, and every ancient chemical system evolution built to keep you alive. And this is the part that fascinates me, the part that I keep returning to because it is the most honest record of what encounter with the figure is, the body does something else. Approximately 60 to 90 seconds into the encounter, if the witness does not run, the cortisol curve changes. Still elevated, still in the range associated with extreme stress, but something else added to it. A different chemical signature, dopamine, serotonin in some accounts. The neurochemistry of attention and interest and recognition. The body begins, after a minute in the figure's presence, to find it interesting. This is not a response to a hallucination. Hallucinations do not produce this two-stage neurochemical signature. A hallucination produced by the hypnagogic misfiring of the brain would produce fear, yes, but not this second movement, this shift from terror towards something else. Something that the clinical literature with admirable restraint calls attentional capture, and what I would call, having read every account and stared at this two-stage curve for months, something far simpler. Fascination. The figure is terrifying. The figure is also, and this is the truth that the accounts reach for and rarely achieve because it is too embarrassing, too compromising, too much the kind of thing you don't say because it makes you sound as though you wanted it. The figure is also something else. It is compelling. The darkness of it, the perfect stillness, the ancient attending quality of a presence that has no malice and no mercy and no concept of you as anything other than a local condition. There is something in all of this that the body, below the level of the mind's objection, finds extraordinary, worth watching, worth staying for, worth the cortisol, worth the racing heart, worth the 60 to 90 seconds of maximum adrenal terror. And that specific, embarrassing, documented neurochemical truth is the reason I believe that people go back to sleep in the same room, that Daniel Marsh lay in the dark and refused to leave Sarah's side, that Amanda Holt stood between the figure and her daughter instead of simply running, that I sat in a hotel room in Portland, fully awake, looked at it directly and said, "I know you're there." We know what is good for us. The body knows what is good for it, and it keeps telling us to run. And we keep not running. I want to describe it properly, not as the witnesses describe it, always partial, always approximate, always frustrated by the inadequacy of language to hold the specific quality of a dark form in a darker corner. I want to describe it as it is, to the extent that I have assembled that understanding from 6,000 accounts and my own encounters, and the two-stage cortisol curve, and 11 years of trying to think clearly about something that resists clarity, the way water resists being held in the hands. It is approximately human in shape. This is the beginning and the most important fact and the most important limitation simultaneously. Approximately human is doing an enormous amount of work in that sentence. It is the height of a human being, the posture of a human being, the basic geometry of a human being, a vertical form with differentiated upper section and lower section, suggesting a body with a head above it. Beyond this, the approximation breaks down. There are no features. This is not the absence of features in the way a distant silhouette lacks features. It is not distance that removes them. Up close, they are absent. Witnesses who have been close enough to the figure to describe what they see where a face should be describe a darkness that is not simply the absence of light, but the presence of something else. A depth, a recession, as though the face space is a window onto a darkness that is further away than the wall behind it should allow. The edges are not sharp. This is nearly universal in the accounts, and it is one of the details that most effectively defeats the hallucination of a person explanation. A hallucination of a human being would have the edges of a human being. The figure's edges are uncertain, not blurred in the way of motion blur or poor focus, but uncertain in a more fundamental sense, as though the boundary between the figure and the room around it is a question that reality has not quite settled. It does not breathe. This, of all the things, this is the detail that witnesses describe with the most consistency and the most specific visceral impact. Standing in the same room as another entity, you hear them breathe. You hear it whether you're aware of it or not. The respiratory rhythm of a person in a room is ambient, part of the acoustic texture of the space. The figure produces none of it. The room, in its presence, has the acoustic quality of a room with one occupant rather than two. And yet the room is full of it. That is the contradiction at the center of everything. The figure is present with a completeness and a weight that displaced air in ways witnesses can feel and bodies respond to with maximum adrenal activation. And it does not breathe. It does not occupy space in any way that physics requires. It is, in the most specific sense of the word, impossible. It is also, and I use this word with full awareness of its weight in this context, beautiful. Not in spite of the impossibility, because of it. There was a woman in a study that Daniel sent me, a follow-up study, one of the post-Portland wave of documents that passed between us in the months when our separate investigations had become intertwined. A woman named Carolyn Marsh, no relation, who described her final encounter with the figure in terms that I cannot get out of my head. She had been a witness for 2 years by the time of the final encounter, 2 years of nightly visitations, 2 years of the figure in the corner at the window at the foot of the bed. She had, she said, come to a relationship with it over those 2 years, not comfort, not acceptance, but familiarity. The specific familiarity of two beings sharing a space for long enough that the strangeness of the arrangement fades into a kind of routine. She had stopped being afraid. She had started leaving the lamp off. She wrote, "On the last night, I know now it was the last night, though I didn't know then, it came closer than it had ever come before. Not to the foot of the bed, closer than that. So close that I could have reached out and touched it if I'd had the nerve. And I almost did. I almost reached out. There was something about the quality of the dark where its face should have been, something in the depth of it, the sense of something beyond it that I thought I could know. I could put my hand into that and I would know what it is, what it's been this whole time. I held my hand up. I held it out toward where its face was. She didn't touch it. She stopped her hand an inch from where the face should have been, and the cold, she describes it as a cold unlike temperature. A cold that was more like the feeling of being looked at than a physical sensation. The cold was enough. She pulled her hand back. She lay down. In the morning, the figure was gone. It has not returned. She told me this with an emotion I found unexpectedly difficult to parse. Not relief, exactly. Not satisfaction. Something more complicated, the emotion of someone who has lost something they know they should be glad to lose. The grief that comes when a danger you had come to depend on removes itself from your life. I think I failed a test, she told me. I think I was close to something and I flinched and now it's gone. And I know that this is completely irrational, that I should be grateful, that anyone normal would be grateful. But I want to know what was in there. I want to know what was behind the dark. And I'm never going to know because I was too afraid in the last moment to reach in and find out. I have read this account 40 times. I have read it because of what it does to me. It makes me want to try. This is the part that was edited out, cut from every version you have ever encountered, because someone decided you could not handle the truth of what was found in that place. They were trying to be kind. I am not going to be kind. You asked for the truth. Here it is. That is what happened to the bodies, to the cortisol, to the reaching hands that didn't quite reach. Now I will tell you what happened to the record. What you just heard was only the beginning. What remains after the figure leaves, this is the thing no study adequately captures, because studies are interested in the encounter and not in the days that follow it. What remains is not nothing, not a return to prior condition. The body, which keeps its honest record, shows changes that persist beyond the event. Witnesses who have had extended contact with the figure, weeks or months of nightly visitation show, in studies that have been conducted and then quietly not replicated, changes in the cortisol baseline. The constant low-level presence of the stress hormone that the body has adjusted to needing. Without the figure, without the nightly 3 a.m. adrenal spike, these witnesses describe a flatness, a quality of the daytime that has become insufficient. They are not traumatized exactly. Trauma implies damage from an encounter with something harmful. The figure, as far as any medical examination can determine, harms nothing. The body recovers. The sleep normalizes eventually. The cortisol returns to baseline. But something has been written into the nervous system that was not there before, some new pattern of activation and response that the body learned in the months of visitation and has not fully unlearned it. The figure leaves a shape of itself in the body's chemistry, not damage, something more like memory. The skin on the arm. I don't know how else to say this. Witnesses who have had the figure stand very close, in the way it stood close to Carolyn Marsh, in the way it stood close to others in the accounts, describe a persistent sensitivity on the arm nearest the figure. Not pain, not injury, a sensitivity, as though the nerve endings in that arm have been recalibrated by proximity to something the nervous system did not previously have a calibration for. Carolyn Marsh still feels it. 3 years after the final encounter, her left arm on cold nights prickles as though something stands beside her. Nothing stands beside her. The arm remembers anyway. January 2023. The journal Sleep Medicine Reviews published a meta-analysis of 47 studies on hypnagogic hallucination. The paper, authored by a team at Johns Hopkins, included for the first time a systematic examination of reports specifically describing the shadow figure typology. The findings were released quietly. There was no press release. The paper was available technically to anyone with database access. Key findings. The shadow figure is reported by 34.2% of participants across all 47 studies. The figure demonstrates less than 3.8% morphological variation across cultural subgroups. Reports of the figure occurring in full wakefulness, not in sleep transition, account for 18.3% of total shadow figure accounts. That figure, 18.3%, is triple the rate from comparable studies conducted 20 years prior. The shadow figure is being reported in full wakefulness at 3 times the historical rate. No explanation for this increase was offered in the paper. Dr. James Callahan, lead author, Johns Hopkins Meta-Analysis, 2023. The increase in wakefulness state reports is the finding we least know what to do with. I can tell you the number. I cannot tell you what's causing it. If I had to speculate, and I want to be clear this is not in the paper, I would say the most likely explanation is increased reporting. People talking about these experiences more openly, online communities normalizing disclosure. But I would also say this, we checked for that. We controlled for reporting rate. The increase persists after controlling for it. I don't know what that means. I'm not comfortable saying I know what that means. Dr. Callahan's paper has been downloaded 47,000 times as of publication. He has not given public interviews on the subject since January 2023. The paper contains one footnote, footnote 34, on page 17, that is not discussed in the text. It notes, in 2 sentences, that 3 of the research assistants involved in the qualitative coding of first person accounts requested reassignment during the study, citing what the footnote describes as personal distress related to content exposure. 1 requested a leave of absence. 1 did not return. Footnote 34. Page 17. 2 sentences that nobody talks about. The cases continue. They have always continued. This is not a historical phenomenon with a historical endpoint. The accounts accumulate with every passing year, not because awareness has increased, though awareness has increased, but because the encounters have increased. The wakefulness state reports have tripled. The average duration of visitation has lengthened. The studies, for those who know how to read them, show a trajectory. March 2023. A family in Kent, England, mother, father, and 2 children aged 7 and 11 all report the figure within the same month. All describe it in identical terms. The 7-year-old, who had not heard his parents' descriptions, drew a picture, a dark human shape, standing, no face. He titled it in his 7-year-old printing, The Watcher. His parents have the drawing. They have not thrown it away. Neither of them has been able to explain why not. June 2023. A dormitory at the University of Arizona. A floor of 22 students. 9 of them file separate reports of the figure within a 2-week period, none of whom have spoken to each other about it beforehand. The campus counseling service refers all 9 to the same therapist, who notes, in a private journal she maintains, which was shared with me in confidence, that the descriptions are identical to a degree that would suggest collusion if I had any reason to believe collusion had occurred. She had no reason to believe collusion had occurred. September 2023. A nursing home in Osaka, Japan. 14 residents in the memory care ward report the figure in the same week. The night nurses begin sitting together rather than doing individual rounds. None of them will explain why except to say, in one nurse's words, "The hallway at night is different now. You don't want to be in it alone." November 2023. A farmhouse in County Clare, Ireland. A family who has lived there since 1962 begins experiencing nightly visitations for the first time. The current owner, a man in his 60s, calls his parish priest. The priest comes. He performs a blessing. He sleeps overnight. He tells the family in the morning that the blessing went well and the house is fine. He sold his house in County Clare 6 weeks later. He moved to Dublin. He has not explained why. The last person to speak publicly about an extended encounter with the figure was a retired firefighter from Calgary named Thomas Ewan, age 58, who gave a recorded interview to paranormal researcher El Nakamura in October 2023. Ewan had experienced nightly visitations for 4 years. He had consulted 4 doctors, 2 psychiatrists, a sleep specialist, and a neurologist. He had undergone an MRI, a polysomnographic study, and a full cardiac workup. He had been prescribed medication for sleep anxiety, which he took for 3 months before discontinuing on the grounds that it didn't change what I was seeing, just made me less concerned about it, which seemed like the wrong response. He described the figure as having changed over 4 years, not in its appearance that was consistent, but in its position. In the first months, it stood in the corner. Over time, it moved closer. By the end of the 4th year, it stood at his bedside. Close enough, he said, that he could have reached out. On the final night he ever saw it, October 3rd, 2023, the night before the interview, it stood at his bedside as it had for months. And then it sat down on the edge of the bed. Thomas Ewan, retired firefighter, Calgary, October 2023. I know how that sounds. I know exactly how that sounds, and I've been a firefighter for 30 years, and if someone told me this, I'd think they were losing it. But it sat down. The mattress didn't move. There was no weight, but it sat down. And then I think it turned toward me. I can't be certain because there's no face to read position from. There's nothing that tells you which direction it's oriented, but something changed in the way the attention felt. It wasn't watching me lying down anymore. It was looking at me like I was level with it, like we were both just sitting there together, like it was the most normal thing in the world. Thomas Ewan has not reported another encounter since October 3rd, 2023. He did not explain this in the interview. When asked if he expected the encounters to resume, he paused for 11 seconds, which is recorded on the tape, and said, "I don't think it needs to come back anymore." He declined to clarify. He has not given another interview. His last recorded words on the subject: "Whatever it wanted from me, I think it got it. And the strange thing, the thing I can't make sense of, is that I'm okay with that. I don't know why I'm okay with that. I just am." Current status: the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke lists isolated sleep paralysis and hypnagogic hallucination as benign phenomena requiring no treatment in otherwise healthy individuals. The ICD-11 categorizes shadow figure experiences under F51.3, sleep paralysis, which is classified as a parasomnia. The DSM-5 does not include shadow figure experiences as a diagnostic category. There are no open investigations at any government level in any country into the shadow figure phenomenon, its increased prevalence, or the mechanisms behind its cross-cultural consistency. The Johns Hopkins meta-analysis, the 47 study paper with its 3.8% variance figure, and its tripled wakefulness state report rate, and its footnote 34, has been cited 22 times since publication. None of the citing papers address the wakefulness state increase. None address footnote 34. There is a file at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., accession number 44117E, filed under the Federal Bureau of Investigation Civil Rights Division, for reasons that are not explained by its content, that contains 340 pages of collected shadow figure accounts gathered between 1978 and 1984. The file was declassified in 2018 under a FOIA request filed by a private researcher. The request form lists the purpose as academic research. The researcher's name is redacted. The file is available. It is available to anyone. It requires a reading room appointment and a government-issued ID. It does not circulate. It cannot be copied. It was requested once before its 2018 declassification. The request date is listed, November 14, 1984. The requester's name is listed. It is the name of a senior official in the National Institutes of Health who retired in 1986 and died in 2002. Dr. Kenji Rao, Anomalous Phenomena Research Group, University of New Mexico, 2023. There is no conspiracy. I want to be very clear about that. There is no active suppression of this research. What there is, and this is a distinction that matters, is institutional incuriosity, which is its own kind of suppression. When data is sufficiently uncomfortable, the mechanism for ignoring it doesn't require a coordinated effort. It only requires enough people making individually reasonable choices not to push on the thing that might push back. Dr. Rao left the University of New Mexico in 2023. His current affiliation is not listed on any academic database. His research page returns a 404 error. The figure is still there. Every night, in 34% of bedrooms. The file is in Washington. The door to the reading room is unlocked every weekday at 9 a.m. No one is stopping you. After all of it, the documents, the numbers, the last testimony, the file in Washington with its redacted name, there is only the house on Birch Road, and the lamp, and what happened on a Tuesday in April that Sarah told me about in a phone call I have not been able to stop thinking about since. Sarah left the house on Birch Road on a Thursday. She didn't leave in a dramatic way. She packed a bag, not all her things, just some of her things, the way you pack when you're not sure how long you'll be gone and don't want to commit to a number. She told Daniel she was going to stay with her sister in Bangor for a little while. She said this without meeting his eyes, which was unlike her, and he stood in the hallway and said okay in a voice that meant he understood without her needing to explain. Before she left, she closed the closet door, all the way until it latched. She did not know why she did this. She would not be able to say if you asked her. Some things you do for reasons that don't exist above the level of feeling. Some things the body does because it must. The house is quiet now. Daniel is there. He's grading papers some evenings. He's growing his tomatoes, which are always a little better than they should be. He waved at Mrs. Calloway at the mailbox last Tuesday, and she waved back, and neither of them said anything about the porch light, which Daniel leaves on now every night, alone on Birch Road. He sleeps on Sarah's side of the bed. He has not said why. The study where Emma sleeps on weekends has a nightlight now, a small one, the kind shaped like a crescent moon, that casts just enough of a glow to show you the corners. The corners are empty. They are always empty now in the daytime when the lights are on, when the world is going about its ordinary business. Daniel knows this. He checks. He's a paying attention kind of man, and he checks carefully, and the corners are empty. But the closet door. Every morning when he wakes, the closet door is open an inch. He closes it. Every morning. He hasn't told Sarah. He hasn't figured out yet whether telling her would mean she came back or whether it would mean something else. Whether the thing he would be calling her back to is the house on Birch Road or the particular quality of presence that they shared in those months. The knowledge between them that the corners were occupied, that they were watched, that they were known. He isn't sure if he's being honest with himself, which one he misses more. The closet door is open now. He'll close it in the morning. It opened while he slept. And after the quiet, after the closed closet door and the porch light, and the man alone on Birch Road checking the corners, there is only the oldest question. The one that was there before the first human being dreamed the first dream and woke in the dark, and saw the first shape standing at the edge of the firelight. The one that has no answer we are built to receive. It was here before you. Whatever you believe about the nature of consciousness, about the architecture of the human brain, about the mechanisms of sleep and perception and the hypnagogic threshold, whatever framework you bring to this question, you must begin here at this fact, which is not disputed by anyone who has looked at the data with open eyes. The figure pre-exists humanity's capacity to report it. It is in the oldest records, the cuneiform, the papyrus, the ochre on the cave walls that we have not yet fully translated, and may never fully translate because the pictographic systems of the Paleolithic were not designed for translation. They were designed for communication with whoever came next, with the future, with whoever would stand in that cave tens of thousands of years later with a flashlight, and the cold understanding that the people who painted these things were trying to tell us something that was urgent enough to press into the rock. The shape is there, in the cave paintings, in the margins, dark and upright and faceless. It was watching them too. 30,000 years ago in a cave in France, a human being pressed ochre to stone and painted a dark standing shape in the corner of the image, not as the subject of the painting, not as what the painting was about, but as a presence in the background, a watcher at the edge of the scene, as though it had always been there, and the painter was simply being accurate, as though omitting it would have been the lie. This is what the data means. Not that our brains are malfunctioning, not that 40% of the human population shares a sleep disorder, not that the temporal lobe, in its ancient vigilance, generates the same protective hallucination in every culture on every continent across every century of human experience. This is what the data means. We have been watched for 30,000 years by something that does not require our awareness of it, that predates our awareness of anything, that will continue long after every bedroom on Birch Road and in Edinburgh and in Portland and in Osaka and in County Clare is empty and dark and still. It does not need us. It has never needed us. We are interesting to it for reasons it has not communicated, and we are not equipped to determine. And it will still be there, watching, still, patient, still, attending to whatever it attends to in the dark. When the last human eye closes for the last time and the last bedroom goes dark and there is nothing left to watch, except it will still be there, watching the dark, the way it has always watched the dark, before us. But I who began this as research, as methodology, as the careful accumulation of evidence toward a conclusion that I assumed would be containable, manageable, something I could write up and submit and present at a conference in a room full of people who would engage with it professionally, I cannot end here, in the cosmic, in the scale, because the scale, however true, is not what I live in. I live in the Edinburgh flat. I live at 3 in the morning. I live with the corner. I live with the knowledge, and this is the knowledge that has cost me most, the knowledge that I would undo if I could, the knowledge that arrived that night in Portland when I said I know you're there, and it turned, the knowledge that I am, in some way I cannot articulate with the precision I have spent 11 years developing, known. Not by name, not as a person, not in the way that another human being knows you, with your history and your complexity and the full particular weight of your specific existence. Not like that. Known in the way that a fixed point in space is known by the things that move around it. Known as a location. A consistent presence in a specific room that something vast and ancient and patient has included in whatever accounting it keeps. I wonder on the nights when I can still think clearly, which are fewer now. And I note this without drama. I note it as data. I wonder if the accounting is benign. If the watching is nothing more than the attending of something so far beyond our scale that our categories of benign and malign do not apply to it, the way they do not apply to a mountain or a deep current or the slow rotation of the earth. Or if the accounting is something else, or if the distinction matters from where I am. I close my eyes now. The research is finished, or rather, the research has finished me, which is not quite the same thing but rhymes with it in the way that dark things rhyme. I close my eyes and I listen to the flat's particular silence, the traffic 3 floors below, the radiators click and hiss, the specific acoustic quality of a room with 2 occupants. Wait, whatever has been watching you since before you were born does not need you to believe in it, and it does not need you to look. And if you understood, truly understood, the patience of a thing that has been standing in the corner since before the word corner existed, you would close your eyes right now and you would lie very, very still, and you would hope, with everything left in you, that it is still only watching.